Old people of Reddit. What were the back in my day things your old people told you about back in the day? My grandma told us about my great-great-grandpa leaving his family farm at the age of 11 because he didn't get along with his dad. He traveled around working on farms until he met my great-great-grandmother, who was the daughter of a farm owner, and they ran away together at 16. That's really sweet actually. Sweet child labor. Everything was better back then. My great-grandmother told me stories about her family traveling from Ohio to Arkansas by wagon and on a Mississippi River ferry. It was her father and mother and 8 children, all girls. My great-grandmother's name was chosen when her mother wrote to her mother-in-law in Scotland asking what to name the new baby. Of all the lovely Scottish names in existence, Mother McQuiston suggested Mabel. So that was my great-grandmother's name. When she was a little girl, great-grandmother received a gift of a doll with a porcelain head. She described it as the prettiest thing she ever owned. She owned many lovely things throughout her life, but she said that doll was most precious to her. Her sister broke its head by dropping it on the marble top of a dresser, and she said she cried for days. My mother has a collection of about 8 dolls passed down from great-grandmother. She never threw anything away. My great-grandmother was born in 1893 and saw the age of technology boom from the Model T Ford to the space shuttle. Of all the inventions in modern times, I think she was most impressed with Scotch tape. There was nothing she wouldn't try to fix with Scotch tape. My mother still has a pull toy originally given to my grandmother. It's a wooden horse and buggy, and the poor horse's tail fell off sometime in the 1950s, but it's been reattached many times in the last 70 years, always with Scotch tape. Fascinating. Imagine witnessing that much advancement in technology in the span of a lifetime. She must have had a marveling life going through all that, especially with the invention of Scotch tape, haha. It's really remarkable how much innovation went on in her lifetime of slightly less than 100 years. You know, the Wright brothers' first flight was in 1903 when Grandma was 10 years old. On the date of her death, I was an aviation electronic technician serving with the US Navy working on FAR 18s. She lived with my uncle in Pensacola, virtually underneath one of the Blue Angels training facilities. My grandfather's mother was Miami Indian, and he frequently talked about growing up with her side of the family during the Depression. I remember him talking mostly about making corn liquor with his uncle and hunting pheasants for food. He said he didn't understand why rich people paid too much money for something he ate so often he was sick of it. A 70-year-old friend of mine told me that her mom had caught, I think, polio as a child, and the doctor's prescription was cigarettes and aspirin because vaccines hadn't been invented yet. I've heard cigarettes was a fairly common medicine way back. There were special medical cigarettes made from plants other than tobacco used for certain ailments, usually coughs and throat problems, too. Some of the plants used, such as henbane, are actually way more toxic than tobacco, and dosage could be tricky when prescribing medical cigarettes. They used to treat asthma with DMT cigarettes. It takes 3 hits to fly directly to the center of the sun. You can accomplish this in under 2 minutes. There is zero way I could sit through a 10-minute cigarette of the stuff. My father told me that people were afraid that if they traveled on trains that exceeded 30 miles per hour, they would disintegrate. Yeah. One expert opined that the human body could not withstand speeds in excess of 25 miles per hour. A top-end racehorse going at a full gallop can go that fast, lol. Usain Bolt had been clocked at 27.8 miles per hour. Lol, humans faster than cars confirmed. One great uncle talked about his childhood in the state orphanage. Another talked about liberating French wine cellars during WWII. My grandpa would talk about blazing trails for roads and building bridges and dams throughout the state. My grandma talked about keeping her preemie twin siblings alive by putting them in the wood-burning stove overnight. Back in my day, we warmed up in the oven. Our place was so cold that we had to take turns warming up in the fridge. This made me laugh in real life. Thank you. We always try to one-up each other's suffering at family gatherings. I'll be sure to use this one. Another one, my grandparents were early adopters of technology and got the first TV in their neighborhood in 1949, I think. My dad didn't know what it was when he first saw it, just thought it was a weird looking radio. He was 21. My great grandma was born in 1914 to a Native American woman and an Anglo man. She would tell stories of washing clothes in the river as a kid and making all of her own toys with the help of her 11 siblings out of fabric, clay and wood. Her favorite thing was bells. The first time she saw a handbell she was 20 years old. Her house was full of bells of all shapes, sizes and materials. She had several valuable possessions, but her most cherished was the bell her husband gifted her on their wedding night. He jokingly told her to ring it any time she needed his help. After he passed, she would ring it any time she needed a jar open or something small fixed. She'd try herself, unsuccessfully, ring the bell, and try again. She swore he was the one opening all the stuck jars. My grandfather's mother was Miami Indian and he frequently talked about growing up with her side of the family during the Depression. I remember him talking mostly about making corn liquor with his uncle and hunting pheasants for food. He said he didn't understand why rich people paid too much money for something he ate so often he was sick of it. I accidentally read peasants instead of pheasants and was thoroughly confused and worried for a moment. Me and the boys slaughtering the local peasantry for food. My grandpa was born premature. The doctor said to let him die. His mom put him in a show box under the wood stove as sort of an incubation thing, which of course worked. He lived to be 89. My dad was locked out of the house in high school, so he went into the garage, found a random key, grabbed my grandfather's woodworking file, and carved a new front door key for the house based off of memory. WTF. Who can do something like that? Old locks were pretty shit for the most part. That's why you can open them with a skeleton key. Lol. My dad's not that old. He was born in 1950, so this had to be around 1968 or so. Just a regular house key we would still use today. I'm not particularly old, but my maternal grandparents didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity when they were kids. That would have been in the 1920s, and they were farm folk at the time. My grandmother died 2 years ago. She was 99 and really loved her iPad. My grandpa grew up with no running water or electricity until he was about 18. They lived in a small house in the middle of their giant farm in the middle of South Texas during the Depression, and he said they never knew it was even happening. He remembers his family's first tractor, when you still had to crank them to start, and the day his grandpa was burnt alive by it when it exploded while starting. He was one hard-ass MF who did 3 tours in Korea and was a rancher almost his whole life. We are so far removed from that life now, and it's bittersweet to me. Those people were so hardworking and grateful for what they had, even though it wasn't much. I wish I could have learned more from him. My mom, born in 1927, used to say that in her day women always wore a bra. It's funny how by 1927 bras had only been around for about 13 years. To be fair, back in her day wouldn't have been 1927, given bras aren't typically worn by newborns. Good point. My grandmother grew up during the Depression and talks about raising rabbits to butcher. Her mother would can the rabbit meat after her father skinned them to sell the fur to the army. She says skinned rabbits look like dead babies because the ears come off when you skin them. Her mother also made clothing out of potato sacks and wouldn't teach any of the kids to sew because she didn't want them to mess up and end up wasting material. She likewise wouldn't teach them to cook in case of messing it up and wasting food. There was a much bigger divide between religions at the time, too. She and her family were Protestant and her best friend in school was Catholic. She walked to school every day with that friend. But on Sundays when walking to their respective churches, the friend would walk on the opposite side of the road and wouldn't acknowledge or speak to her. One day one of the Catholic boys showed up at the Protestant church just to listen to a service and completely blew everyone's minds by being curious. He only came the one time, and they let him sit in. But it was unheard of at the time. Later, when my grandmother met my Catholic grandfather, the Catholic priest in my grandfather's church was going to refuse to marry them. Grandma had to strike a bargain with the bishop of the area and agree to raise any potential children as Catholic if she wouldn't convert to Catholicism herself in order for them to be married, or the bishop would have excommunicated my grandfather for marrying a Protestant. In the end my grandfather was allowed to remain in the church and marry my grandmother, but the priest wouldn't allow them to stand on the altar during the ceremony and they had to stand in front of it. Edit. Wow. I had no idea the church was still this strict. Thank you everyone for the comments sharing your similar stories. I wasn't raised Catholic myself because my mother had never enjoyed going to church and stopped once she had grown up. I suppose I should have realized the Catholic Church is still strict because they wouldn't baptize me as a baby because I was born out of wedlock. My grandfather hounded my mother to get it done, even though she didn't want to, so she tried just to appease him. When she got to the appointment to discuss and plan everything, she found the door was locked and nobody would answer, so she just never had it done. I think this is why my grandparents got married on the steps of the church rather than inside. My great-grandmother wouldn't forgive or speak to my grandma after she married a Protestant. This was the late 1940s. 5 years later, with 4 kids in tow, my grandma goes to her grandma's house. Her mom and daughter, two angry Catholic great-grandma, died when my grandma was young due to hospital infection. Great-grandma tried, but couldn't shut the door in her face due to my aunt's little blonde curls. Gonna assume the last line is not literal. And she wasn't trying to slam the child's head in the door. Shut the door in her face is a common expression where I'm from. It just means refuse to allow to enter. My mother remembers when the Detroit River froze over in winter. She also tells me about buying socks in Detroit and smuggling them back to Windsor in her bra. Why would she have to smuggle socks? Apparently the cotton socks weren't available in Ontario and would have to be declared and taxed. I'm impressed by your knowledge of historical import laws and taxes. My dad used to talk about how my grandpa took him fishing after he got home from work 3 to 4 times a week. He thought it was great fun and wonderful, and they always stayed until they got some fish. Even if it got late, it was to feed the family. They were poor, but my dad never sensed it. He really never thought, gee, we sure do eat fish a lot. As a kid I would hate that. That's because we're aware of all the options. His dad was most likely not, and assumed fish was the standard. I'm only in my late 30s. But my father was 50 when I was born, and he was born in the 1930s. The biggest back in my day thing for him would be friendliness. When he moved to a new neighborhood, one of the first things he always would do is go around and introduce himself to all his neighbors. In 2020, you are more likely to get the stinky from the new neighbors as you haul your shit into your new place. He also lived most of his life boarding with others. He had money, he had a fantastic career, and made great money for most of his life. From his time in college until meeting my mom in the very late 70s though, he'd rent a room from a family with a room to let and live with them. That's fairly uncommon now. Although for single men, that was pretty normal then. He was the worst nightmare of every European, I think. He'd try to talk to you and get to know everyone he could, even in the checkout line of the grocery store. The definition of the overly talkative, loud, annoying American. For him it was normal to want to know everyone. The upside? He had friends everywhere. There are some funny stories of him traveling in Japan in the early 80s, doing his usual thing, and having some serious cultural clash. I tried to introduce myself to my neighbors in Tennessee and got the cops called on me for knocking on a door. What? For real? OMG. Another one, my grandparents were early adopters of technology and got the first TV in their neighborhood. In 1949 I think. My dad didn't know what it was when he first saw it, just thought it was a weird looking radio. He was 21. My parents got married in 1963. They bought some furniture from a local store, but didn't have any money left for a TV set. They delivered their furniture plus a TV. My mom called the store and told them about the mistake, and the owner said he was just lending them one for free until they could afford it. My great-grandparents said they complained about not being able to go to school because they had to work the farm after 8th grade and could no longer make friends and socialize. I believe back then most public schools only taught up to 8th grade. After that you would have had to fund your own schooling. My grandparents only went through 8th grade. 2. There was one high school in town that they could have gone into higher grades for. Unfortunately, they are not around any longer for me to ask, but they never were embarrassed about their level of schooling. In fact, they seemed to think additional schooling was mostly a waste of time. Neither of my grandparents finished high school either, but they built and owned homes, ran a farm, retired comfortably, and never had a single credit card. Wish I had done that. I'm in my 30s, so not an old person, but my grandmother grew up during the Depression, and steak was a luxury for their family as they had little money. My great grandmother, Mamal, had a gentleman friend over one night for dinner and told her children to behave as if they had steak all the time, as she had bought steak to cook to appear more wealthy at the dinner table with the guest. When the steak was served, the 3 kids chanted, "We have it every day, we have it every day." I still get a laugh from this story. Steak was such a treat back then. She would say, "I don't know about you, but steak is still a big luxury. I have steak maybe once or twice a year on a special occasions." Yeah, steak has definitely been an every few months treat throughout my life. Maybe I need to check steak prices again. My mom told me that her grandfather used to stop the car if they came across horse poop. He kept a shovel in his car at all times for this reason, so that when he got back home he could put it on his rose garden. Somehow I feel that was less back in his day and more here's some weird shit Gramps did. Maybe it was just something people who liked gardening did. The fish back in the day were huge and plentiful. My grandpa showed me pictures of the red fish he caught over the years. You can clearly see as the decades go on they get smaller and smaller until the 90s when they put strict commercial fishing rules in, and then they got a little bigger. Never anywhere close to the 50s though. The vegetables were bigger too. My grandpa's potatoes were so big, you had to peel them to get them in the house. Mayo. My grandma, not really, but she babysat us when we were kids. Grew up in Hazard Kai in what must have been the 20s and 30s. She'd tell us stories like the time she broke her arm as a kid after falling off a horse, and her brother set it out in the field. No further medical treatment. Her younger sister, 3 or so, was eaten by the family pigs. My dad always said we should record or write down some of her stories, and I really wish I had. I assume it was an accident, and they didn't feed the kid to pigs. Pigs will eat anything. If you are new to TattleTale TV, please subscribe. We have new videos every day. Stay tuned for more coming up next.